This is Ray, and I'm responding to Jeff Mann's video on what is poor in spirit, or what does it mean to be poor in spirit. Before I get started, I just want to ask, if you look in the bottom right of this video, you'll see a little subscribe button. And also, if you're on the YouTube channel, you'll also see a subscribe button on the right, on the page, on the channel, with also an alert bell. If you can click those, you'll get updates when we go live or whenever we upload pre-recorded videos. So we'd greatly appreciate that if you would like, share, subscribe, follow, ding the bell, all the things. So in Jeff's previous video, in our conversations, we're going back and forth in the Sermon on the Mount, and we're talking about each topic, and we're going through right now specifically the Beatitudes, and he talked about poor in spirit in his previous video, and he asked me how is it I would describe poor in spirit. And so one of the comparisons that he made, or one of the things he said was, when I like to think of what something is in the Bible, I like to try to think of what the opposite would be. And I really liked that approach to it. And so he said the opposite of poor in spirit in his mind would be self-sufficiency, being able to rely on yourself, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, being independent, being able to accomplish many things, but doing it on your own, devoid of community, devoid of people, and potentially even devoid of God. And so that was his way of kind of framing out what it means to be poor in spirit. Is we want to resist self-sufficiency and press into full reliance on God, So we're looking in Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, and we see, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So you can see the beatitude is split into three parts. There's a blessing, there's the nature of the beatitude, and then there's the benefit of the beatitude. And maybe in more videos, we'll get into what the blessed means, and also what the benefit of the beatitude is, or participating in the beatitude. So I would say we're mostly right now just focusing on the unique identifier within each beatitude. So in this case, it would be poor in spirit. So who are the poor in spirit? And I would answer similar to how Jeff answered. And I would say it's those who see their own spiritual destitution, devoid of God, and they respond with repentance and with humility, right? So you see, we see our great need. We see our need for God, and we understand that He's the only one that can meet that need. We can't meet it on our own. We can't work hard enough. We can't be stronger. We can't be more independent. We want to break off, as Jeff said, all self-sufficiency. And I think of that as the gateway into the narrow way. I don't think it's a coincidence that Jesus opens up the sermon with this, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," and then ends it later about staying on the narrow way. I think this is the gate. This is how you get into the narrow way, is you recognize you're in need of salvation. You need the indwelling spirit, and you need the justification. You're ultimately going to need the justification by faith through Jesus's blood. So blessed are the poor in spirit. We're breaking off that self-sufficient way of life and the way of doing things. So now you got to understand too, in the Sermon on the Mount, one of the things that Jesus is doing is he's making contrasts and comparison between a genuine disciple or a genuine follower of who Jesus is, and then somebody who's just living in pretense, or in his case, he's using the Pharisees as an example. And so you see him say throughout the sermon, he says, you've heard it was said this, right? You were taught this, but I'm telling you that it's actually this. And what he's teaching, what Jesus is teaching, is he's getting down to the heart motive. Like, hey, inwardly, there needs to be a transformation that works out outwardly. And for the Pharisees, there wasn't an inward transformation. It was just a very pious standard that needed to be lived out outwardly, but there wasn't a demand for change in the inner man. And so Jesus, one, he's not asking us to change devoid of his help. So that's really important. I said that in my intro video. So he's not exhorting us to be something that he's not going to help us be, right? So when he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he's like, I'm going to help you maintain this attitude. I'm going to help you maintain this way of life, this way of humility. So I'm not just exhorting you to do something. I'm actually going to inspire and help you to do it. So you can see in Luke 6, a very similar sermon. It's oftentimes referred to as the Sermon on the Plain. Okay, and Jesus is going to hit a lot of the same points that he hits in the Sermon on the Mount, which is in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. But in Luke 6, there's 4 beatitudes, and then there's 4 woes right after the 4 beatitudes. But in Matthew, we don't get the woes until almost the end of the book in Matthew chapter 23. Now, the woes in Matthew, they don't go one for one, and there's a kind of a little discrepancy with the second beatitude and the second woe. And I won't really get into that because it would take a hot minute to get through it. But the woes are very similar to the beatitudes, except the woes are a caution to rejecting that way of life, rejecting what it was that Jesus taught when he opened the Sermon on the Mount. And so you can see the very first woe, Jesus is going to say to the scribes and the Pharisees, he's going to say, "You hypocrites, you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces," right? "For you don't go in, you're not going in, and you don't allow others to go in either," or you're not allowing those entering to go in, right? And so you can see that similar language there in the woe with the first beatitude, which is, theirs is the kingdom of heaven, right? Those who are entering, they are poor in spirit. They recognize their need for God. They recognize that they can't do it on their own merit, their own works, or their own ideas, right? But the Pharisees are the opposite. You guys, you're actually not going in, you're not inheriting the kingdom, and you're preventing others from going in. And so you can see that with the woes. And now as we go through the Beatitudes, I'll try to break down each one of the woes with one of the Beatitudes in each video. Okay, so we see again, now Jesus is similar in the way that he operates in his ministry and how he, in his reliance on the Father. And so with Jesus, he says, "I don't do anything unless I see the Father doing it," right? And so in the similar way, we could say the same thing. We only do what we see the Spirit doing. We only see what we see Jesus doing. We only do what we see the Father doing. We lay our lives down and we give it to him, and then we emulate him. We become who it is that he wants us to become, empowered by him in the Holy Spirit. So he says, John 5:19, Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son of Man can do nothing of his own accord," right? We can't do anything of our own accord, right? Jesus is saying, be like me in this way, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise, right? So Jesus is in submission to the Father. And in another way, it's like you could say that with the exhortation to poor in spirit is like we just do what we see the Father doing, right? Matthew 11:29, Jesus says this. He says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." He says, "Because I am lowly and I'm humble in heart. And in this way, you'll find rest for your souls." And so it's that same kind of idea. It's like when we have our own yoke and our own way and our own independent way of doing things, that's the heavy yoke, right? Fighting for our rights, being defensive, trying to be heard, trying to be understood. All the things that we're tempted to do in our life in these ways, they put a heavy burden on ourselves. And there's many other ways to do that. Those are just some examples. We put a heavy burden on ourselves, and we place a heavy burden on other people. But Jesus says, no, like, learn from me, become like me. I will help you, and I'll give you an easier yoke. Now, it's still a yoke. There's still work to be done, but this yoke that I'm going to give you, it's going to help you get through your life in a much more peaceful or restful way, okay? Meaning that on our inner man, right? I'm expecting transformation on my inner man. My circumstances may or may not transform, and I might have a season where my circumstances are really awesome, and then a season where they're not so awesome. But I'm not really looking at my circumstances as much as I'm looking at the rest that's going to be on my inner man by becoming more like Christ. Okay. Psalm 51:17 says, "The sacrifice pleasing to God is a broken spirit." You will not despise, meaning God will not despise a broken and humbled heart. James 4:10 says, "Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you," right? And so there's all these exhortations to humble ourselves and to become like Christ and to lay down our self-sufficiency, lay down our self-righteousness, lay down our desire to accomplish things in order for our own name to be great, and to take up our cross, to give our lives to Jesus, to lay our lives down for our friends, to lay our lives down for our enemies, and to serve those that persecute us, right? Jesus is going to say that, to rejoice in our persecution in the last beatitude. So I'm running out of time. That pretty much sums up my first take at poor in spirit. I think Jeff is going to make another video on poor in spirit, which may mean in turn I will again mention it one more time. But after that, we'll move on to blessed are those who mourn. Thanks for listening.